Development Goals. Over to you, Dr. Max. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Susanna. Thank you very much. In particular, I would like to say a huge thank you to Kolani and all his colleagues at the SAREP regional partner. Really grateful for this organization and also for choosing this important and difficult topic, a very difficult topic. So I will share my presentation with you. So I've slightly adjusted the title, which you can see here: Climate Change and Sustainable Development, the Role of Education and Science for a Change of Mindset. So I will focus in the second part more on this idea of education and change of mind. However, starting with sustainable development, I would like actually to put the emphasis on something that is related. So in this slide, you will see something is related, which is unsustainable development. So this quote I will read with you. It's from a document developed by the United Nations as part of an initiative called Education for Sustainable Development. And this statement is, in order to halt the current model of unsustainable development, societies must work on a change of mind or behavior. So this is what I want to get to eventually with this presentation. But I would like to start, obviously, with the unsustainable development. Why? Well, because somehow, over the past years, we have seen with more increasing frequency these colorful icons. Perhaps they give a nice feeling. The title is Sustainable Development Goals. They look very promising. There is a lot of positivity and good energy, which is great, by the way. However, it shouldn't trick us into thinking that what we're doing is sustainable development. To be honest with you, there's much evidence that what is going on throughout the world, so I'm talking globally now, whether it's Europe, United States, Africa, Asia, sadly, is still very much unsustainable development. However, moving towards the idea of education, we've done a lot of workshops on the SDGs. Why? Because we wanted people, including young scientists, to know about them, but not just to know the colorful icons. You see, behind each one of these icons, you have specific targets. Now, some of those targets are truly inspiring and truly wonderful, very well thought out. In particular, if we were to talk about the major topic of focus for today, which is climate, even here you could see interesting targets. But let's get back to the idea of education. In the workshops I mentioned, in many of them, we asked a question. I asked a question, and here it is. The question is, are you familiar with this limit or with this number? And actually the question was asked twice, okay? I don't have time now to do a virtual interactive poll with you, so I will go a little faster. The second question, which is the same question, is, are you familiar with this number or limit? And really in the poll, the results accumulated, now I'm going to show you the results accumulated over 3 or 4 different workshops, is the following. For the road speed limit photo, we have this kind of trend. So a lot of people say yes, hardly anybody says no. I'm worried about those people that says no, but never mind. Even more worryingly though, there's a small number of people that are familiar with this number here, which is 350 parts per million. Most people are not familiar, and they are familiar with this. So the point that we were trying to make, or I was trying to do now with you, is that we have an issue. The issue is what I call that we have common knowledge. So this 50 kilometers per hour speed limit, although it could be a bit different depending on the country you live in, and also whether you use miles per hour. If you use miles per hour, it tends to be 30, but the concept is always the same. We have knowledge that is common to a lot of people. And sadly, we have ignorance that is common to a lot of people. And I include in those people, without offending anyone, I hope, scientists alike. And to me, it's not acceptable that scientists are not familiar with the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. For over 1 million years, we had 280, no more. It didn't go above 280 parts per million. Scientists told us in the past decades that a safe level would be 350 parts per million. Right now, December 2021, we're well above 400 parts per million. So I repeat, I think it's not acceptable that these amounts, this concentration of CO2 are not common knowledge, especially among scientists. But this is the reality. Now, this one example of common knowledge and common ignorance could be expanded with several other examples of high scientific relevance, but I don't have time for that. So I will just immediately focus on the knowledge action nexus. Given that we have the common ignorance I described, and I could describe it further as I mentioned, we should be extremely aware that both science and education are key to knowledge. Science can provide new knowledge, education can consolidate and explain current previous knowledge. With knowledge, okay, empowered with knowledge, people can understand, we can understand processes, problems, phenomena, etc. Once we have understanding, only then we can get into action, okay? We cannot expect action from people unless there is understanding. And once you have action, you can then finally have change. And I hope you remember that statement I read to you before from the United Nations talked about change in mind and behavior, but that's the first step. So you cannot have change unless you have all of this. That's why I want to put emphasis on the role of education and science. However, in addition to the problem of ignorance, common ignorance, there's another problem, which is the lack of responsibility. So now I would like to say something about that. I would like to go back to a conference that UNESCO held in 1997, so not particularly recently. But as an outcome of that meeting is a declaration, the title of which is Responsibilities of the Present Generation Towards the Future Generations. I would like to highlight 2 articles in that declaration. Article 4 and Article 5, respectively, on preservation of life on Earth and protection of the environment, both in function of the future generations. Now, some of you may have children, okay? Some of you are going to be parents. And I would argue with you that when you become a parent, at least that happened to me, you become less selfish, okay? You think more of the life, the future life and the future activities and well-being of your children. Maybe you think that, okay? Of course, we should think that anyway, even if we don't have children, but much more so if you're a parent. So I think this is very, very relevant. But responsibility, I call this parental responsibility, okay? I think it's not the only one that is important. I would like to read with you this one here, which is by Nobel Prize laureates, an anthropologist and a zoologist. He said, we live in an age in which it is scientific researchers who are able to see specific dangers quite clearly. Therefore, they have a duty to speak out. So I call this scientific responsibility, okay? And then I would like to talk about another responsibility in the next slide, which I call, I don't know, social responsibility or world responsibility or whatever we want to call it. But that responsibility is pictured in this cartoon. The responsibility is that unfortunately we have a very unequal world. We have societies where there is a huge amount of consumption, and unfortunately and sadly societies where there is very little consumption. And this has an effect, or is very relevant to what we're talking about. So the responsibility is parental, is scientific, but it's also social and global. I would like to talk about this one more because it's so extremely relevant to the issue of climate change. There is an increasing discussion on what is being referred to as extreme carbon inequality. For instance, in this diagram, what you see is that for a given average person in the United States, we have a certain amount of megatons. This is megatons of CO2 released by the impact, the life, the activity of that person, as opposed to 1 megaton of CO2 per person in a country such as the Philippines. Now, this is absolutely outrageous. This is extreme carbon inequality, okay? Nevertheless, even if the Filipino is not responsible for a great amount of emissions, sadly, the extreme risk over there is much higher, while the vulnerability in the United States is less. And again, this is due to differences in technology, in science, in wealth, in capabilities and tools and skills to deal with the consequences of climate change. Before I heard the word adaptation, and adaptation is possible to some extent here, and much less so here. That's why knowledge is key, education is key to empower people and make them understand what the problem is, and therefore be able to adapt to some extent if adaptation is indeed possible. In some situations, it definitely is. But I would like to expand on this topic a little bit more. Extreme carbon inequality can be seen very nicely in this diagram, where the richest 10% in the world are responsible with their lifestyle, unsustainable lifestyle, which is what I was talking about before, unsustainable lifestyle, are responsible for half of the world emissions. And I think we should remember this. But not because some countries are poor and are responsible for a tiny amount of emissions, that does not mean that they should develop unsustainably. Actually, they could set a fantastic example to the rest of the world. And I want to talk a bit more about this here, focusing on electricity, for example. We've got over 7 billion people in the world right now. 1.3 billion have no access to electricity or no access to a constant electricity supply. That we saw the impact of that lack of access to power, to electrical power during the COVID pandemic, because of course people in a lockdown situation, both because of lack of electricity or lack of connectivity, couldn't have access to education or access to research, collaborations, and so on. Now, focusing on electricity, given that generation of power is the primary cause of climate, the climate issue, it's also very interesting to note the extreme inequality that we still have. So I'm showing you Spain here with 47 million people and a consumption of 243 billion kilowatts, which is way greater than the consumption shown here for all the countries in the African continent, appearing here in a darker shade, with a population of 860 million. So note the extreme level of inequality that we're talking about. But I would like to argue very positively that this can change through knowledge and science and education. How? Well, if we talk about power and accessibility to power, we should remember that, for example, in 2016, this was a very important climate forum discussion. Some of the world poorest countries made an amazing commitment and set an example to the wealthy countries. They committed for green energy and therefore very sustainable development. Now, is there any example of this? Of course there is. And what is the real potential for this? Well, if we look here, in what way does Europe have any solar potential? Well, very little, I would say. But if we look at the African continent, it supersedes any other area in the world in terms of solar potential. So solar potential is not just photovoltaic, there are other technologies as well. And this is a great promise for sustainable development and access to electricity for the African continent. In particular, a leading role example, leading because it's worldwide leading, not just leading in Africa, but leading worldwide, is given by Morocco. Note that this article is from 2016, it's not from last month. And in fact, this solar plant, which was called Noor 1, is then followed by Noor 2 project and even Noor 3. And many more of these could be done even with better technologies, because the technology of that first plant is now improved much further, and they've overcome some technical difficulties. Again, you can see how science and education and putting things into practice can then get technology improved and move forward. So here you have totally green power being produced in the African continent, and so much more of this could happen. Why do we need to worry about power? Well, power, as I said before, gives you access to electricity, better connectivity, and so on. But power can also be key in irrigation. Now, irrigation in a number of situations is critical. And it's critical because, as this Nature paper shows, but there are many other scientific papers that show the same, climate change is starting to affect crops, the yield of crops. And if that is the case, that is indeed an extremely worrying trend that we need to be aware of. So once again, you see, science and education can give you knowledge, can allow you to understand and be very sensitive to what's happening. In particular, I want to now connect to something that to us, the World Academy of Sciences is doing. This work by these colleagues in the United Kingdom, so you've got Aaron Davis and others, are talking about coffee. Why is this something that to us is interested in, not only interested in, but to us is trying to do something on this, is because so many communities depend for their livelihoods on coffee plantations. There are many regions and countries, not only in Africa, that are already suffering because the yield of coffee, the productivity of the plantations has been seen to decrease due to climate. So some plants, not all plants, but some plants cannot cope with the changes that are taking place. So this is really key, again, is to seek new varieties of plants, varieties that might be more drought tolerant, heat tolerant, whatever, you know, and so on. So again, the scientific approach and the knowledge is extremely important. This, you may say, oh, this doesn't affect me if I'm doing, I don't know, engineering. Not true. Not true. Remember that climate is an extremely interconnected and interdisciplinary challenge. Therefore, I would provoke anyone to be interested and take action. In terms of this thinking, I would like to read this quote with you. In the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called upon to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground. And I think this is the time. These are wonderful words, in my opinion. They are very suited to this challenge and to this time. And also to the fact that, as I said before, it's just an example. I gave the solar potential, the solar atlas that I showed you signifies that. That's why I want to come back to the knowledge action nexus. I want to come back because I hope I am convincing you that this is really key to achieve change. We cannot achieve change if we're not thorough in our approach to knowledge, okay? Now, let's assume I'm a biochemist. Should I focus only on molecules inside the cell? No, of course not. Of course not. You may say it's unreasonable. What I'm saying is unreasonable, that I get interested in climatology or ecology or agriculture. Well, you know, I repeat, we are faced with challenges that are highly interdisciplinary in nature. And therefore, we need to keep an open mind and an open perspective, because as this lovely graphics suggests, we should not be changing the climate. It's time we change our minds. And how do we change our minds? How do we start to change our minds, to have a different approach to our work, to our research, to our family, to our colleagues, to our students? Well, in this way, looking at ourselves. And so let me read my last quote for today. Progress is impossible without change. And those who cannot change their mind cannot change anything. I don't have time to show you that I didn't want to talk to you like a hypocrite, just saying things that I would like to show examples of how I've been trying to change my own mind and my own approach, but there's no time for that. And why did I want to do that? Because the most typical question in the climate change debate is, oh, well, this is happening. This is huge. What can I do as a single person? Oh, surely there's nothing I can do. I mean, this is something that big governments, big people, high-level people can decide. They can need to do policies. Partly it's true, but you can still do a lot of things. And as I said, I don't have time to prove that to you, but please have a think. I hope I have somehow triggered some reflection. And one way to start is to educate yourself. There are a number of free online courses. There's plenty of scientific literature, such as some of the papers I showed you, and there's way more. And I very much think that as I've done myself and some of my colleagues have done. Educating yourself is the start in order to understand, in order to embrace knowledge and what science is producing. So I'm happy to take questions, and very, very grateful to Kolani and his colleagues for organizing this event.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Max, for that insightful presentation. And I'm sure we do have quite a number of questions, because I do have questions myself, but I'll be checking on the chat box. But what you linked today, actually you've triggered, you've activated the appetite for us to go and, teach ourselves and learn more about the topic. But how you connected the dots, starting with action and understanding and linking that together to science and education. And also what you've emphasized is more on the science and education, aligning those to the Sustainable Development Goals. That is very, is a paramount importance, aligning that to the Sustainable Development Goals. Colleagues, participants, it is time for questions. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box at the moment. I don't know if I can ask my question in the meantime then. Okay, just while we're waiting for question, Dr. Max, I do have a question. And one of the items that you've highlighted here was in terms of responsibility, in terms of scientific responsibility and social responsibility. And that as scientists, it's not only about sitting in our labs, but we have that responsibility. But my question now is, how do you activate that appetite for someone? For example, I'm in this webinar, but someone might not even interested to come and attend. But while listening to you, I'm activated the hunger to go and embrace my social responsibility. But for someone who's just saying, I want to stay in the lab, how can you activate that hunger? And another question just on that, if we still don't have questions, is when you were talking about how unsustainable are we as a nation, as a globe, my question to that is, what type of metrics and what type of indicators can we put in place to see or to measure when we have, achieved that level of sustainability that we think we've achieved? Thank you. Thank you, Doc.
Okay. For the first question, someone is in a lab, they're focusing on what they're doing, and seemingly they're not interested in other topics, areas, or the climate issue in this particular case. How do you trigger the appetite? How do you unblock or move them? And I think this question would be much more difficult if we were talking about anyone in society or a politician. A politician, you see, a politician speaks a different language, a language of economics, a language of employment, a language of sometimes, unfortunately, self-interest. But I would argue that for a scientist, even a scientist that is deep into his research, into the lab, it shouldn't be so difficult to trigger the appetite, because a scientist by its own nature, I would hope, embraces, number one, knowledge. There is a natural hunger for knowledge, a natural curiosity to understand, to explain. And two, there should also be a natural way, a strong feel for help, for contributing to humanity. In the moment in which you understand, even if it's not your own areas in your field, I said to you, if say I'm a biochemist, but I can understand the basic aspects of some other areas, such as climatology or ecology, well, how can I ignore that? I can't, and I shouldn't. Why? Because I understand, I have the understanding that the challenge is we are facing are compromising our future. Let's say I don't have children, maybe I don't have children. Well, so what? I should still care about my fellow humans, wherever they are and whoever they are. So in my opinion, it's not justifiable for any scientist in any field to be uninterested in other areas of science, especially when these areas have such a strong relevance to global challenges. I think, you know, over the past decades, by the nature of the scientific research pursuit, we have become narrow, very narrow. We focus so much on a very particular area of knowledge in our own studies, whether they're in the lab or in equations or in modeling, whatever it might be. And in a way, that's just the necessary nature of what we're doing, but we must keep an open mind at the same time. We must keep an awareness of the global context. For your second question, how to relate, say, sustainable development goals to people, and how to promote and how to do better. The first thing I would comment on what you said, which perhaps you got from what I said, is that I said that we are living in an unsustainable way. Well, I should qualify that, because to be honest with you, when I say that we are, I'm referring more we, meaning we, because I'm in Europe, and so I really should say we in Europe are the most perhaps unsustainable. Perhaps even the ones in North America are even more unsustainable. I don't think that unsustainable lifestyle should apply to every country in the world as they're living now, because there are obviously communities and areas that are much more sustainable. However, there is a perception that because they do not have so much technology, or they're not developed, they're not advanced. So there is a problem here. We need to shift the paradigm. Living in a sustainable way and being highly developed are not necessarily the same thing. You actually, what we see now is, in most examples of high development, they're also highly unsustainable. So there needs to be quite a lot of changing in the way we think and we act. How to then relate SDGs and climate as being probably the main global challenge there is to start small, start from your own sphere of influence. What's your sphere of influence? It could be your friends, it could be your partner, it could be your children, it could be your students. I mean, if you are all scientists, then you are all in contact with students. Imagine how much power you have to plant seeds and to nurture a new way of thinking, a new culture. And I would like to finish this answer by telling you this, that it doesn't matter how unsustainable other parts of the world are. Anyone who wants to can become a role model. And a role model can always trigger change.
Thank you very much, Dr. Max. Dr. Max, I'm aware that you have another meeting after this. However, we have a number of questions that are coming up in our chat box. So I'll have to request from you if I can take 2 of those questions or 1 of them before you leave this session. Will that be fine with you?
Yes, I can be with you until 59, because yeah, I have a meeting with a donor, an important donor. So I'm so sorry I have to leave you then, but please, let's go ahead. Okay,
the first question is from Dr. Festus. And what he's asking is, what are the cogent responsibilities of individuals to prevent climate change? That's the first question. And the second question is from Dr. Muse. My question is to Dr. Max. Thank you. Okay, thank you for the interesting presentation. How do you see the importance and nexus between attitude, perception, and practices within the communities to fight climate change? And the last one is how far are we achieving climate action under UN Sustainable Development? Those are the three questions, Dr. Max. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so the first question about how can individual start or behave or take action towards climate change. As I said in my presentation, I think, to be honest, the very first is to gain knowledge. We're not all experts on everything. So if you are an expert in agriculture or engineering, I'm an expert say in biochemistry. We are pretty much in the same shoes, meaning that we are not experts in climate. So we can gain knowledge. Gaining knowledge will allow us to understand a bit better. We also should gain knowledge to find out and discover the links between climate issues and what we work on. Maybe there are links. The other thing is that there are a number of simple actions and behavior that one can take to promote individual steps towards being a role model and doing something towards climate change. And these steps could be, again, education of who? Well, your neighbors, your children, whoever you can affect, you can communicate that to. You can change your lifestyle as much as it's feasible by taking actions to modify habits, to modify technological things that you use in order to reduce your emissions. But most importantly, you may say, oh, but that is such a tiny reduction compared to, I don't know, whatever is going on in I don't know, United States. Sure, but you are being a role model. That's my point. If we all said, oh, someone over in another country is doing all of that, therefore I will not. No, that's not a logic. The logic is, if we all start to do something, will affect more and more people. And that's I think the nice way, ethical way to do it. I don't have time to go into to give you examples of what I've been doing. There are a number of examples I would like to mention, not to show off, but just to prove my point. But to move on to the next question, yeah, there is a connection, as you wrote, between attitude, perception, and practices. I think that it's a good question, because without minimizing the importance of science, to be honest, there is enough science. Science has, or if you were to look at enough papers, science has proved, has provided huge amount of evidence, and also the science is also already pointing towards solutions, pointing towards critical areas where we need action. I told you about some crops, etc. So when you talk about practices, perception and practices, that's exactly where the action is missing. There needs to be more translation of knowledge provided by science into technology, into real action. So, when you talk about transportation, when you talk about how cities are designed, when we talk about agriculture, and the list can go on and on and on. And education for sure. So perhaps I will say a few words about education, because it was the main theme. My personal input, for example, in education has been, and this is again putting things into practice, you're talking about practice, has been to develop a teaching module for education on climate. This teaching module is something that it has got nothing to do with my current job. It's something that I've done over the past year in my very spare time, So this is voluntary, paid by nobody. But there are many examples of how you can apply knowledge and do something concrete. This is what is missing, concrete action. You see, Greta chose not to go to school. Well, I think we should be going to school, and I think a teaching module on climate could form a new generations of people that at least have got basic understanding, because once you've got basics, then you can build on that. I think there was a third or fourth question, right? Oh yeah, how far are we in achieving the climate action under UN sustainable? We're not far at all. So there is a website you can look up if you wish. It's called, I think it's called Climate Tracker, if I remember correctly. And this website shows or categorizes nations according to emissions and according to policies and actions. And unfortunately, you can see how little is actually happening globally. But there are countries that are doing. I showed you the example of Morocco. It's not the only example. Morocco is clearly a role model, but there are other countries that are providing fantastic, positive, inspiring ways forward.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Max Bawoli. This topic is timely. It's insightful, it's inspiring, and it's calling for action. But due to time, we will not be able to continue with the questions. I call Lani and the organizing team, if they can make sure that the questions do get to you for response. But however, thank you so very much and all the best with your work.
Sorry, I have to leave you. I'm really sorry. Goodbye. All the best.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, then colleagues, now we'll move to the second session. The second sessions, we have three speakers, apologies for that. So for this one, is three speakers, and after the speakers, we'll have the Q&A. May you please drop the questions in the chat box while the speakers, if you have any questions, while they are carrying on with the presentations. And for our second speaker for today is Dr. Negusi Beyene. She holds a PhD in analytical chemistry from Karl Franzens University in Austria. He was a postdoctoral fellow for 2 years at the Department of Chemistry, University of Pretoria, South Africa, and senior postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Chemical Engineering at URV in Spain. He has worked as clinical chemist and head of regional health research laboratory in Ethiopia, as a lecturer at Jimma University, Ethiopia, and as an assistant professor at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. Currently, he is a consultant analytical chemist for the GICHD on its project with Apopo in Tanzania. Over to you, Dr. Beyene.
Hello. Thank you, the organizers, for organizing this interesting meeting. And currently I'm working on a tuberculosis detection using animals, using rats. That is my kind of permanent job, but as an independent consultant, I do environmental health research, and I did MSc in public health with focus on environmental health from University of London. And I did a couple of contributions to climate change and health research to policymakers in Africa. And I should tell you that I'm not an economist to speak on the economic aspect of climate change. But as I said, I did a couple of contributions to policymakers, and my presentation is based on my work on these assessment reports. So let me share my slide. Can you see my slides, please?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you.
If you can go on slideshow, Doc.
Okay. So I'll talk about the impact of climate change on economy or socioeconomic activities of Africa. And as you're aware, Africa's economy is mostly subsistence and rain-fed agriculture. And because Africa is surrounded by different oceans like Indian Ocean, Atlantic in the north and south west, and Indian Ocean, Mediterranean Sea, and Red Sea, we have a number of fishery potential, and people are relying on that for their living. And we have livestock where we have pastoralist community rearing livestock. And then we have tourism, and this tourism is based on the beach, as we have oceans and national parks and game reserves, mostly in southern and eastern African part, and then mining again in the eastern and southern Africa, and industry in most of the African countries. So all these are affected by climate change. And we have the agriculture part, which may have a decreasing or increasing effect depending on the extreme weather pattern. And then we have fishery can be affected as decreased fish catch, decreased in fish processing factories. And then, as I said, we have tourism, the coastal areas, and infrastructures like roads and water availability affected by the climate change. So around 53 countries are reported on their hazard concern related to climate change, and about 40 countries reported that flood, drought, temperature increase, and change in precipitation patterns are their main concern. And around 25 countries reported sea level rise and storm are their main concern related to climate change. There are wildfire, landslide, and dust storms, but were not significantly reported. So when we see the number of reported disasters in the period 1970 to 2019, we found that like 60% were due to flood, followed by 17% storm and 16% drought. And then if we compare the economic losses in this period, we have significant amount, 37% due to storm, and 34% due to flood, and 26% due to drought. But when it comes to the reported deaths in this period, like 731,000 deaths, 95% is because of drought, and only 4% because of flood, and 1% because of storm. So in the period 2000 to 2018, we have different reports from different countries, like number of disasters, damage or decrease on the GDP, and then affected persons. So you can see epidemics are the main disasters, significantly in DRC. And then we have floods. So you can see the patterns. Mostly it is epidemics when it comes to disasters. And we have floods followed by droughts. And when it comes to damage to GDP, flood is significant in most countries, but in Madagascar it is storms, because Madagascar is surrounded by the Indian Ocean. Again, when we check, when we see the number of affected person, drought is most significant in almost all countries, and followed by floods. So what is the impact of these disasters in the Sustainable Development Goal? So we have rising poverty because of these disasters. We have food insecurity. We have health issues, water scarcity, damaged infrastructure, rising inequalities, displacement of people, ecosystem collapse, biodiversity loss, and conflicts because of these disasters. So if we see sector by sector and region-wise, you can see that Eastern Africa and Western African regions are significantly affected in terms of GDP by the effect of climate change on agriculture. Here, due to lack of data, the Northern African region was not included. And if we see the coastal sector, again, we have the Southern region, Southern African region, and the Northern African region significantly affected, followed by the Central African region. And then when we see the health sector, again, Eastern African region and Central African region are significantly affected in terms of mortality and morbidity. And in tourism sector, again, Southern African region, Eastern African region are significantly affected, followed by Northern African region. And fisheries, again, because of lack of data, only two parts of Africa are included, the northern part and the western part. Although all Africa, as I showed you when I started, is surrounded by different water bodies, and fishery is one of the main activities, economic activities, but data was not available to extrapolate the impact. So we have the Western African region significantly affected by climate change. Again, when it comes to the water resource, Eastern African region is significantly affected. So this is the net damage by 2050, extrapolated net damage in 2050 in two climate scenarios, when we have below 2 degrees centigrade and when we have above 4 degrees centigrade. So again, the Eastern and Western African region is affected significantly. And this is the net damage in 2100. Again, when we have the below 2 degrees centigrade and the above 4 degrees centigrade. And again, Eastern African region and Western African region. And comparably, the Southern African region are significantly affected. So this is the net, again, the net damage, including the adaptive investment, the adaptation cost, and residual damage. And again, we see this is for 2050, and Eastern Africa and Western African region are significantly affected. And this is the same for 2100. And again, Eastern African region is significantly affected, and Western and Southern African region have comparable net damage. So if we see sector-wise, you can see agriculture is significantly affected, followed by the health sector in terms of mortality. And then we have the tourism, and morbidity is also the part of the health sector. So to curb all these economic impacts, what Africa needs to do. So we have a number of African initiatives that should be replicated. For example, we have the Great Green Wall Project, which aims restoration of 100 million hectares degraded land and creation of 10 million jobs in 11 countries. And we have the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, which aims in restoration of 126 million hectares of degraded land in 30 countries. We have the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program in South Africa, which aims to install 17.8 gigawatt renewable energy in South Africa by 2030. And we can also include the example mentioned by Dr. Max Paoli, that is the Nur1, Nur2, and Nur3 solar projects in Morocco. We have the Consolidated Waste Management Project in Rwanda, and we have the National Plan of Municipal Waste in Morocco. All this can be good examples to be replicated in other parts of Africa to curb the impact of climate change in the African economy. And what other things that we can discuss? How about indigenous knowledge, African indigenous knowledge? Recently, I learned about the concept of syntropic farming. I'm sure it is new for most of you. And this is indigenous knowledge originated from Latin America. So when the newcomers or the colonizers went to Latin America, they saw that the indigenous people were just cultivating little, just digging here and there and planting vegetables and crops. And the newcomers thought that the indigenous people are very lazy. But the indigenous people were treating nature. They were trying to maintain the natural ecosystem. And now people learned about this, and they connected it with a hell lot of scientific knowledge, and now they're advocating for it. They call it ecosystem restoration in the natural way. And it's an abundant farming style, and nature takes care of everything. They don't need any fertilizer, they don't need any pesticide or herbicide. The only thing is they just simulate the natural environment and use it to get abundant vegetable, abundant fruit, and forest. So as you know, Africa is rich in indigenous knowledge. And can we revise the African indigenous knowledge and come up with similar adaptation and mitigation strategy for Africa? So this is just to trigger future discussion on the use of African indigenous knowledge for ecosystem restoration, as it has been practiced in Latin America by the indigenous people. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Bayen, for that informative presentation. That was informative, tying up the disaster, how it impacts the SDGs, be it about food, be it about biodiversity, be it about health, be it about inequalities. But now at the end, you wrap it up, proposing a solution in terms of the indigenous knowledge system, in terms of restoring our ecosystem. Thank you so very much. That was very informative. For this session, we have two more speakers. We're still gonna drink from the sea of knowledge. And then we'll be taking the questions at the end for all the three presenters for this session. So if you do have a question for Dr. Bayen, please do put it on the chat box. However, now we'll move to the next speaker. I'm not sure though, let me just confirm before I introduce him. Is Prof. Francois here? I'm aware that he was having a meeting before he was going to join this session. However, if he's not yet in, we can move to Dr. Naidu and then come back to him when he arrives. Okay, so I think silence means he's not present at the moment. So we can move to then Dr. Naidu. Dr. Naidu holds a PhD in plant biology and a postgraduate diploma in higher education, and serves as an associate professor in plant ecophysiology at University of KwaZulu-Natal, and more recently grants and monitoring and evaluation officer at the South African Technology Network, SATN. He is a fellow of the South African Young Academy of Science, research fellow at the University of Western Cape, member of the South African Association of Botanists, and member of the Botanical Society of South Africa. In addition, he serves on the editorial board of the South African Journal of Science and on the steering committee of the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies. He is currently the executive director of the Institute of Natural Resources. Over to you, Dr. Naidu. Thank you. Your mic.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, colleagues, for affording me the opportunity to speak here today. Can you see my slides first and foremost?
Yes, we can, Doc.
Okay, thank you so much. So just to confirm, I am presently speaking to you wearing two hats. Firstly, that of the Institute of Natural Resources, and secondly, that of the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies. And I'm going to take the opportunity here today to put forward an argument. My colleagues that spoke before me shared with you the facts, and I'm going to try to bring climate change and the pandemic together as part of my argument. And my argument is that building pandemic resilience can be achieved through integrated environmental management. And hopefully the argument that I put forward will be one that will trigger some discussion later on. So first and foremost, what I need to say is that climate change is intimately entwined with health and functioning of the biosphere. And it is evident that it's impacting on ecosystems through changes in climate variability, and there's lots of evidence. I mean, I am preaching to the converted, so to speak. We understand that climate change is taking place. But most people do not immediately recognize that climate change interacts with other pressures on ecosystems, degradation, defaunation, fragmentation, anthropogenic impacts. So most people still see climate change as a natural phenomenon. And there's a need to understand that ecological dynamics of climate is also a consequence of the built environment, of man's input, of anthropogenic inputs. So whilst people understand that climate change is caused by anthropogenic actions, most people do not immediately see that the interactions of man with the environment is leading to complex dynamic changes in the environment. And it's difficult to separate where nature begins and where man ends in terms of our occupation of this planet. So more and more, we are starting to see the built and natural environment blending into each other. So an important point that we need to, I think, understand is that ecosystems can assist in the mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And the mechanisms, the potential, and the limits of nature-based solutions to climate change need to be explored and quantified. We are looking at very high-level solutions sometimes that are very technically complex: solar parks, renewable energy, decarbonization through compressed gas under the Earth's surface, whereas the more simpler solutions, the nature-based solutions, are the ones that we are not paying enough attention to. So what are the limits? And I think the Stockholm Resilience Center have done a very good job of trying to identify what the limits are. What is the safe operating space for humanity? And they've identified 9 processes that can be used as an indication of what the limits are. Then the stability of these 9 processes that range from freshwater use all the way through to biogeochemical flows, the stability of those 9 processes gives us an idea of the delicate balance between nature and humans. And these processes can be used to understand climate change across disciplines. There are 9 sort of universal processes that can be used to understand what the limits are. But what's also important to point out is that these processes are the ones that humans have impacted on most profoundly. So how bad is the situation? Well, all life on Earth and human civilization are sustained by these vital processes. However, our species, due to rapid population growth and explosive consumption, is destabilizing these processes. So it's endangering the stability of this operating space. So humans already exist outside the safe operating space when we look at those 9 processes. And I'm not going into any detail because I want to keep it very high level today because I want to put forward an argument. So we are already out of the safe operating space for 4 of these 9 planetary boundaries. And what's evident, what's clear, is that in order to prevent overshoot of the remaining 9 boundaries that have been set, we have to revamp our energy and our food systems. And this is the start of my argument. And it's nothing new. All I'm saying, and all many people in the world are saying, is that we need to not only look at humans and nature as socio-ecological systems theoretically, we need to look at them in terms of our practice and our living as well, and our planning and our management and our policy. So everything that separates nature and humans needs to be revisited in the context of socio-ecological systems. The social component being humans and the ecological component being the biosphere. So humans, societies, economies, are embedded in the biosphere. And people, economies, society, and cultures depend on the biosphere. So social ecological systems emerge as a consequence of this interaction between humans and nature. And the central aspect of these interactions is that nature provides humans with ecosystem services. And in interacting with nature to take advantage of this ecosystem services, humans are impacting on nature. So it's a very, very simple argument. And this is my point of departure, that a paradigm shift is needed. And this being the biosphere resilience must be seen as a precondition for social justice, economic development, sustainability, and hence pandemic resilience. So very simply, what I'm trying to say is that we can't talk about the end of apartheid. We can't talk about social justice. We can't talk about the end of gender-based violence. We can't talk about pandemic resilience until we start conceptualizing biosphere resilience, because they are inseparable. They are too intimately linked to separate. So what I'm trying to say is that what we can do is build climate change resilience. And by building climate change resilience, we can build pandemic resilience. And if we look at the 2 concepts, they are very closely linked. Climate resilience being the adaptive capacity for socio-ecological systems to absorb stresses, to adapt, to reorganize, to evolve into configurations to deal with future climate change impacts, and pandemic resilience being the ability to deal with shocks of a pandemic and recover from them. Now, pandemic resilience requires approaches and tools that permit society to control highly infectious disease while preserving essential public institutions, mobilizing the economy to provide surge capacity to fight disease. So you can't fight disease and build pandemic resilience and build a healthy society unless you have a healthy economy. But the argument here is that many economies are heavily reliant on the natural resource base and ecosystem services. So What this means is that pandemic resilience requires approaches, tools that prevent resource depletion, right? And that prevent environmental degradation or loss of ecosystems. Very simply put, healthy society equals healthy environment. Healthy environment equals healthy society. So COVID-19, right, in terms of its initial symptoms, let's reflect now. So first and foremost, there was widespread underpreparedness of countries in managing the pandemic, right? And it was evident that this revealed how fragile our economies were. The shocks exposed a heavy reliance on a linear as opposed to a circular economy. But there were some environmental positives, but these were soon eclipsed. And the environmental positives were brought about by the lockdown. Humans stayed in their homes. They didn't impact on the environment. Industries shut down, right? Which wasn't positive for the economy, but what it was positive for was the environment. But these were very soon eclipsed by the increased waste generation, the increased demand for raw materials for manufacturing PPE, the shutdown of the recycling sector, increased production of single-use plastics, widespread non-sustainable natural resource use, right? Most importantly, water. And then the COVID-19 symptoms, the environmental symptoms started to develop. There was wide range environmental, economic, and social consequences, right? And this impacted majorly on sustainable development goals. What the crisis has highlighted is the need to extend the scope of sustainable development to aspects that haven't previously, right, been included, such as health, right? There was a lack of attention to wash and wastewater generation. There was widespread non-sustainable use of natural resources. And this lack of attention to how we were using natural resources in this period of the pandemic was probably because the spread of several recent outbreaks has not necessarily been shown to be environmentally dependent. In fact, because most of them were not waterborne, we've probably ignored it completely. But what's important is that there were some small signs where scientists highlighted this. Some active ingredients were shown to be a threat to the environment, those contained in sanitizers. The PPE waste that was entering natural environments was starting to be found in oceanic waste. And then what developed was a waste, what we're calling a waste fever, right? And the waste prognosis is that WASH measures integrated across the world to prevent the disease was starting to impact on water resources, increase wastewater, right? There was an exponential increase in medical waste. There was a disruption in medical waste management. There were exponential increases in packaging waste from online shopping. Even the use of Mr. D, increased disposable plastic bags. There was a dramatic increase in both organic and inorganic waste, right? People were at home. They were eating more, they were buying more, they were wasting more. The constituents of domestic waste was also changing. We were starting to see things in domestic waste like masks and gloves and sanitizer containers, which usually never make its way into domestic waste and never make their way into landfills. So COVID-19's effect can be seen in the form of waste and recycling fires. This is data emerging from the US and Canada, but anecdotal reports also exist for South Africa, right? And what we are trying to see is that In March 2016 to 2019, the waste profile in the US and Canada looked very different to March 2020, when we were in the midst of the pandemic. So you can see immediately that waste papers and plastics increased dramatically. And you can also see that things like rubber started to disappear, but organics and chemicals started to increase. So there was a change in waste profile. And what more and more people have come to realize is that managing a pandemic requires managing the environment. And that is the argument that hopefully I will leave you here today. That to manage COVID-19, we need to manage the environment in a more systematic way. But how? How can we achieve this? One way is to revisit the ideas of old, right? In the early 2000s, in fact, in the 1990s, people were talking about integrated environmental management. People were talking about a holistic approach to the management of the environment, right? And to integrate management activities through stakeholder committees composed of government and non-government representatives, right? Our government, our scientists, our practitioners, our community workers were so overwhelmed by what was happening in terms of the loss of human life that they lost track of the fact that nature was being equally impacted upon. And this is what an integrated environmental management approach can do. Because it involves assessing, implementing, and monitoring through a systematic way, it involves a more holistic understanding of the environment in which humans exist and a more holistic understanding of how we impact on the environment, particularly in periods of shock, such as a pandemic. Now, there are three legs to integrated environmental management. And I'm not going to go into detail today because I think this is something that you can read up about if you want. But what it calls for is integration, environment, and management. To integrate multidisciplinary approaches of knowledge and information interpretation, right? To integrate policies, to look at the environment as natural and physical resources in a biophysical, social, and economic matrix, right? And to manage these in a stepwise process of initiating, planning, and implementing. So I'm not calling for anything new. All I'm calling for is for us to revisit the theoretical approach of integrated environmental management. So what I'm saying is that an integrated environmental management-based approach to building climate and pandemic resilience. So we need to bring climate and pandemic resilience together if we're going to manage future pandemics and even a resurgence of the current one better. Integrated environmental management needs to be embedded in disaster management. IEM is an approach to the management of the environment that can accommodate for its complex, multifaceted nature, particularly when we look at it as a socio-ecological system. IEM is a framework that promotes holistic and interconnected management of environmental systems, right? It is a framework that is a theoretical and practical way of managing socio-ecological systems. So my take-home message is that through an integrated environmental management, we can stretch our policies to manage and plan for the limited resources to be used more sustainably during a pandemic and rebuild our post-pandemic economy on the backbone of our natural resource base and ecological infrastructure. So building climate and pandemic resilience will require us to exploit opportunities associated with practical management, restoration, and protection of ecosystems. The way forward is for us to accept the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals need to be revisited or redesigned in their entirety. We cannot expect the developing world and much of the developed world as well to be held to the Sustainable Development Goals when they are struggling to keep people alive. We have to start exploring new types of partnerships and more realistic approaches to integrated environmental management, such as the 4 returns framework, which calls for us to restore the environment, but not at the expense of social financial returns, right? So we have to accept the fact that climate change mitigation is sometimes unaffordable, and in some contexts, not a priority. But when we couch mitigation and ecosystem restoration and ecosystem protection in the context of social and financial returns, then it makes for a much more sellable and acceptable argument. That's where I'd like to stop for today.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Dr. Nigel. That was a challenging presentation, and yet you provided us with the practical ways on how to do some of these things, going back to the fundamentals, moving from the complex to a nature-based type of solutions, and also a great need of a paradigm shift when trying to resolve these issues. Thank you so very much for this presentation. We'll be going to our next speaker, and then we'll take the questions from all the participants and the attendees. Our next speaker for today's session is Professor Francois Engelbrecht. I'm so sorry if I pronounced it wrong. He obtained a PhD in meteorology at the University of Pretoria and specializes in numerical climate model development and regional climate model. He leads the development of the first African-based Earth system model with national and international partners. He's an associate professor at Northwest University and an honorary research associate at the University of Witwatersrand, where he is currently the director of the Global Change Institute. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much, Tozama, for that introduction. I think you have mixed up there several of my CVs stretching over about 10 years, but that's very interesting. Currently, I'm professor of climatology at the Global Change Institute at WITS. I'm also now director of the institute, as you've mentioned. So let me share the screen, everybody, because we have so much to discuss. By the way, my apologies for running a bit late. I was, as the organizers know, in a meeting organized by the Netherlands Embassy in Mozambique about climate change impacts in Mozambique. And as I'm sure you all appreciate, that was such an intense discussion given how vulnerable Mozambique is. The meeting ran late, but here I am now. So Zoom is not doing exactly what I expected. I trust everybody can see the slides in presentation mode. Am I right?
It's not, if you can go to from the beginning, we can see the slides, but they are not in presentation mode, Prof.
Okay, let me just
from the beginning. We can
try again. Sure, I'll try again. I'll try again. Here we are. Any change or not?
Perfect. Now it's presentation mode.
Oh, perfect. Okay, let's start then. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what we have learned from the 6th assessment report from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also from the 26th Conference of the Parties, the United Nations Climate Negotiations meeting, about what we can expect in terms of future climate change impacts in our region, Southern Africa. So as many of you will know, the IPCC assessment report was released in August this year, the Working Group 1 report. Immediately after it's released, it started to make headlines across the world. The United Nations Secretary General called it the code red for humanity. And that is, as I think many people in this audience will know, it's because of Earth warming up faster, even faster than we previously thought or projected. And the window that we have left open to avoid the most catastrophic outcomes of climate change, that window is rapidly closing. In some aspects, it has closed already. So how do we react to this report? How do we convert climate science into action? I'm going to try to talk to all of this in the next 20-25 minutes. On the picture there on the slide, you can see it was a photograph taken during the big fires in the European Mediterranean in August this year. But nowadays, of course, when we switch on the television, we just see more and more evidence in front of our eyes of climate change happening. Just think, for example, of that unprecedented heat wave in the Pacific Northwest in June, the flooding in Germany in July. Right now, the absolutely devastating drought in southern Madagascar. So it's becoming less and less difficult for me to convince people of the evidence of climate change. I find that the evidence is becoming widely accepted. But still, despite of this awareness about climate change, action in terms of preparing by adapting to climate change or mitigation action to slow down global warming, these actions are still just not happening at the scale where they should be happening. Let's cover a bit of the background more before we get back to this point on climate action. These are the types of outputs you'll find in the 6th assessment report from IPCC. So global warming into the future is really in our hands. Where we are sitting here today in 2021, the world has warmed so far by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. That is now relative to pre-industrial climate, before we started pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, the future level of global warming is in our hands. If we are going to continue to drive the world's economy using fossil fuels, we are heading towards 5 degrees Celsius of global warming by the end of the century. There's only one word for that, that will be catastrophic. I'll explain soon why. This is what COP26 tried to achieve. It tried to get the nations of the world to agree to mitigate climate change so rapidly and so strongly that we can reduce global warming, that we can restrict global warming to a level below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming are the so-called dangerous levels of global warming. I will soon explain why those are the dangerous levels. But we should all, of course, see the red or hear the alarm bells ringing. 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming right now means we are very, very close to exceeding the first threshold, dangerous threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. What do I mean with mitigation scenarios? I mean this type of depiction of our decisions into the future. The slide shows carbon dioxide emissions in gigatons per year over time. So right now we are emitting about 40 gigatons, a staggering 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. A fossil fuel future means that will increase even more. This type of future takes us to about 5 degrees Celsius of global warming. On the other hand, we have this type of future. This is what COP26 tried to achieve, halving the emissions by 2030, carbon neutrality by 2050. If we can do this, we have a good chance of restricting global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius and an excellent chance of restricting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So what happened at COP26? I'll give you a very brief overview because our time is limited. But effectively, global warming is meaning, well, COP26 tried to achieve, in the first place, the end of coal, if I can phrase it that bluntly. So the International Energy Agency recommended several months ahead of COP26 that at this conference, the nations of the world should agree to stop all new fossil fuel supply projects. That's a very, very strong statement from the International Energy Agency. No new coal-fired plants, for example, should be approved across the world. What did we achieve? Well, the one positive aspect is that there was an agreement of the world's biggest economies to no longer fund overseas coal projects. Even China, even well ahead of COP26, said it will no longer fund overseas coal-fired plants. For South Africa, it means we will never get funding again to build another Mdupi or Kusile type coal-fired power plant. There were other important agreements reached at COP26, for example, to end deforestation by 2050. How wonderful will it be for the planet if this can materialize? There's $20 billion to give momentum to this agreement. Several countries, including the United States, agreed to cut methane emissions. Methane is also an important greenhouse gas, with 30% by 2030. But overall, if we look at the concrete commitments, COP26 is still implying the agreements made there, a staggering 2.4 degrees Celsius of global warming this century. That's why many people say the conference has failed. It didn't bring us close to commitments, concrete commitments, that can restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Take note of the fact that the world is going to change in front of our eyes despite this failure. The USA, the UK, the European Union, Japan, South Korea are all committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. They will only invest in renewable sources of energy moving forward. It is estimated that that investment may be $130 trillion by 2050. So the world's going to change. And countries that are going to walk the path of mitigation can expect large investments, developing countries. But resisting the transition is going to imply economic penalties in the long run. And China agreed to cooperate on climate change mitigation at COP26. That's positive, although there are very little details known of this agreement. And then I think, as many of us know, South Africa has been offered an $8.5 billion just transition transaction. That's over the next 5 years. It can be a breakthrough for South Africa. At last, we can get investment into the economy, into the renewable sector. But I can guarantee you, colleagues, it's also going to be a test for South Africa. If we accept this investment, these cheap loans, the grants, and we manage it in a transparent way, and we gain momentum for our transition to renewables, we will get more investment. We need about 100 times this, by the way, either for economic growth or for investments to make our transition. If we fail and we don't manage this well, then of course, there are many other developing countries standing in the line for these types of investments. So let me talk climate change impacts in the rest of my talk. Sorry for my lights flickering on and off. That's the Global Change Institute trying to save electricity with this automated lights saving system, electricity saving system. I just want to show 2 more slides on the global picture before I talk Southern Africa. We've talked about this slide, future scenarios of global warming. Whatever we do, precipitation will continue to increase across the world's land surfaces on the average. That's because we are committed to further warming and the warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor. Storm systems are more intense. On the average, it's already raining more across the world, land masses, than just 50 years ago. Sea ice is disappearing in the Arctic Ocean. By 2050, under these fossil fuel or low mitigation futures, sea ice will be completely gone in the late summers of the Northern Hemisphere and the Arctic Ocean. A precious ecosystem lost. And then sea level rise. Strong mitigation means we can restrict sea level rise to 0.5 meter this century. Failure to mitigate means we may head towards sea level rise in the order of a staggering 1 meter this century. That will be enough to displace hundreds of millions of people from the world's low-lying coastal areas. And the second slide on global impacts. Take note of the fact that we are on the verge of initiating global tipping points. So somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, we may initiate the irreversible collapse of the Greenland ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheet. That alone is enough reason for us to do everything that we can to avoid these levels of global warming being reached, because it means up to 2 meters of sea level rise by 2150, absolutely devastating for the world's low-lying areas. But in the longer run, sustained global warming of 2 degrees Celsius means 6 meters of sea level rise in 2000 years' time, and 12 meters over thousands of years if both these ice sheets melt irreversibly. We should remember it's not only about us. We will be severely affected by sea level rise, but it's also us, the generation. We will be known as the generation that made planet Earth smaller for future generations to live on. What about our own region? In the last part of this talk, we are warming rapidly. The rate of warming in Southern Africa is about twice the global rate of warming over the last 5 decades. And that continues into the future. Under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, you can see we are the region in the Southern Hemisphere that will have warmed most. By the way, the rate things are going right now, we will reach this level of global warming in the early 2030s. If mitigation fails and we reach 3 or 4 degrees Celsius of global warming in the second half of the century, it will be catastrophic for us. That's the only word. We have to say very directly what it means for us, because these levels of global warming, the IPCC found in its 2018 special report on impacts, that it will mean the end of the maize crop in Southern Africa and the end of the cattle industry. Just try to imagine Southern Africa without maize or cattle. We are a climate change hotspot because not only of this drastic rate of warming, but we are also projected to become drier. We are one of the few regions of the world, one of the few land masses that are projected to become drier, not wetter. We all know that we are a water-stressed region. If we now become drastically warmer and gradually also drier, we are in big trouble. There's very little we can do to adapt if a dry region becomes drier and warmer. And that brings me to the last part of this talk. I would like to put emphasis today on something that I think is of critical importance for our region: tipping points. Changes in the regional climate system in the form of unprecedented climate events we've never recorded before in the historical record. And I'll talk about these 4 main impacts in 4 slides that will follow. Before I talk about them, I just want to point out to everybody, I think something that is becoming clear. There's also economic risks and tipping points that we will have to face in the next several years. Basically, Africa has a choice to make. In its own interest, it can either embrace the transition to renewables and grow African economies using renewable energy in return for substantial investment from the global north. Or we can resist the transition, and I'm afraid we will become the dumping ground of the world's fossil fuel assets or technologies and end up having stranded assets across the continent. So what about climate change impacts? I think the #1 risk South Africa faces in the next 10 years and the next 20 years is a day zero drought in Gauteng. Now, if you read Assessment Report 6 carefully, chapters 4 and 11, you'll see that the risks are clearly indicated. We are heading towards a climate with more frequent and more long-lasting droughts. All that we need for the eastern mega dams to run dry, with that I mean effectively the level of the Vaal Dam below 20%, so that it cannot supply Gauteng with high quality water for human consumption. We need just 4 or 5 years of drought, and we are in that state. And these long-lasting droughts are becoming more and more likely as the regional system becomes warmer and gets drier. In the interest of time, I'll list the remaining droughts because I hope we'll have some time for questions. The second big risk is collapse of the agricultural sector. Now, I've spoken about this. The current evidence is that because of heat stress effects, purely biophysical impacts on the maize crop and cattle industry, we are expecting their collapse at 3 degrees Celsius of global warming, which is roughly 5 degrees, 6 degrees of regional warming in the interior of Southern Africa. We had warning signs. The warmest summer ever in Southern Africa, 2015-16, killed 40% of Botswana's cattle at the end of a 4-year drought. The maize crop in 15-16 was 40% lower than the last year. We are seeing the fingerprints of these impacts in Southern Africa. I think if we combine socioeconomics of farming with the biophysical impacts, this tipping point threshold is at a lower level than 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. We need to think about this very carefully. And then the last 2 risks, heat waves. The report is clear. We can expect unprecedented heat waves in Southern Africa in the next 10 years. The Pacific Northwest killed hundreds of people in the northwestern states of the US and British Columbia and Canada in June this year. Because the people there are not used to these heat waves, they don't have air conditioning. We have millions of people living without air conditioning in our informal settlements. Combine that with a lack of cool water. If you're an elderly person, your children are not close by to help you when the heat wave strikes, it's life-threatening. I'm gravely concerned just about this very direct impact of heat waves in our region over the next 10 years. I don't think we're prepared. Finally, a completely different type of risk. I've just spoken for many hours with colleagues in Mozambique about future tropical cyclone impacts in Mozambique. Tropical cyclone Idai killed more than 1,300 people, the worst flood disaster we've ever had in Africa, south of the equator. The report is clear that intense tropical cyclones will now occur more and more frequently in the warmer world. And for the very first time, a category 4 or 5 hurricane, as the Americans would call them, can move as far south as Maputo. It has never happened before, or even Richards Bay. We are not prepared at all for this type of risk. This is the concluding slide. It's easy to develop feelings of despair or hopelessness when we look at these risks and we realize the developing world doesn't have the future in its hands. It very much depends on what the well-industrialized countries will do. But there are 2 positive aspects I'd like to conclude on. Climate science gives us a very good idea. Projections of the future that we can use with confidence to design adaptation actions. There are limits to adaptation. When the maize crop collapses, it collapses. But along the way, we can prepare for several impacts in the agricultural sectors and in terms of water security. If we have time, we can talk about that. The other important aspect is the level of global warming is still in our hands. It's probably too late to avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, but strong mitigation still will give us an excellent chance of restricting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. So we can still avoid many of the most severe impacts. And that should also give us hope. So with that, I hand back to our chair, and I hope we have time left for some discussion today. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Prof. Francois, for that is informative. And you highlighted the fact that this is in our hands, the individual responsibility, but also the collective responsibility, whether you're talking about in the local context, but also moving to the globe. Thank you so much for that informative presentation. We do have time. We do have time for taking questions, but I'll just also like to announce that we have two of our presenters. We have Prof. Francois and Dr. Naidu that are present for questions. Dr. Bayan had to leave, and also as well as Dr. Max. However, they have said that they will respond directly to any of the panel of the attendees that would like to ask them any questions. So we have about 20 minutes for question and answer session, and we have two of our presenters. And I did notice that in our chat box, we do have some questions. One of the first question is actually asking about the presentations themselves, if they will be shared to all the participants or to all the attendees. I can see the hand, there's a hand there. I'll have to give it to Prof. Francois. Yes, Prof.
Oh, apologies to Zama. I was just trying to indicate a thumbs up to say I'm happy to share my presentation. That's what I wanted to say.
Oh, okay. I thought you wanted to comment. Okay, thank you so very much. On that note, then, colleagues, the link for this session for the webinar will be shared with everyone, and then the presentation will be shared for the presenters or the speakers that have given consent. Thank you, Prof. Francois, for actually showing that you are happy in terms of sharing the presentation. And in terms of questions, I'm not sure if I'm missing something, but I'm not seeing any questions in our chat box. Dr. Knight, you'll have to help me together with Prof. Francois if you see any questions, but from my side, I'm not seeing anything. But I know you also mentioned that you wanted to talk about the adaptation, but there was no time. But let me give it to Kulani. I think you want to say something.
No, thank you. It was just a problem with my additions, but to thank the speakers. And we have requested Dr. Mari from SAGE to give the closing remarks to the session after you have concluded, Dr. Tozama.
Oh, thank you, Kulani. Before we go to the conclusion, I can see Prof. Francois has something to say. I think for the two speakers, if we don't have any additional questions, perhaps they are wrap up or closing remarks from themselves. I'm not sure if there is something maybe they still would have wanted to say before we end today. I can see the hand of Professor Francois. Over to you, Prof.
So much, Tozama. Yes, I see in the chat there's a question from I'm just trying to get back to Kolile Dube. Are there any research opportunities for climate science at WITS and UKZN next year? PhD research? Yes, absolutely, Kolile, there are. Definitely at WITS. I'll be very surprised if there aren't any at UKZN. But please send me an email afterwards. We are now in the process of recruiting PhD students for next year. There are definitely such opportunities. Please contact me. And then, if I may, when I came in at the tail end of Dr. Naidu's talk, I had many interesting points being made. And I would just like, if I may, Chair, ask Dr. Naidu whether he thinks that whether we will learn something about this these shocks to the system. For example, the COVID, the terrible shock to human systems caused by the pandemic. Now, before COVID struck, I was thinking about these types of shocks in the context of climate change. And I thought, what can be the biggest shock to the South African system? And I thought that must be the Gauteng Day Zero drought, if the economic heartland runs out of water. And then COVID struck, and we actually had a terrible, terrible shock to our economy and I mean, to the entire world in terms of society and economy and so forth. But what would you say, Dr. Naidu, if the lessons learned from the pandemic, do you think it can help us to manage these shocks the climate crisis will be bringing to economic systems and human systems across the world, but certainly also in Southern Africa?
Yeah. So I do believe that. I think there's the concept of cross-learning and cross-planning. You know, we are in a process of bringing people across disciplines together to start planning more realistically for these sorts of shocks. But the problem is that the mentality of people who are not in the know is that you plan for the best. So you wouldn't go to Checkers and buy a flashlight for when you have no electricity during a hurricane. You would buy a turkey for Christmas. So there's a need for you know, a change in mentality, and I think that, you know, government that says no one will be left behind. Sadly, we as scientists have not taken that message to heart. I think we've become so engrossed in the love of data love that we have left our common man behind. And I think if there's anything to be learned about the pandemic, is that the more we let people in on the information, the more we had the Slim Karims of the world go onto ETV News and tell people about it, the more people bought into the idea of preventing the disease. So I think more systematic planning and more integrated planning. I mean, why are we planning? The argument that I try to put forward is, why are we planning for climate change resilience? Why are we planning for pandemic resilience? What we should be planning for is for the resilience of socio-ecological systems.
Sure. No one will be left behind. This is very exciting, challenging, interesting topic, and it's so timely. And you know, it's like we can just sit here and be sponge, you know, and really, you know, soak in everything that you are sharing with us. Thank you so very much. I'm not sure if you have any closing remarks. I don't know why from my side I'm not seeing any questions, but if you see any questions, please do read it and do respond to them.
So, Madam Chair, through you, if I can have one closing remark, but Prof, please feel free to go ahead first if you want.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Naidu. Thank you, Tazama, once again for the invitation to present here today, and many thanks to Dianfa, who did a lot of the logistics to get me online today. Much appreciated. I would say we need to take note of the fact that the last 30 years is not enough for our planning for the future. We will be faced with new types of challenges we've never had to deal with before. And that's why I mean in terms of climate change impacts. And that's why I really hope that society will be learning from the pandemic. So how to deal with an unprecedented impact you've never had to deal before. The one thing that climate science does give us is a very good idea of what the risks are. So why are we not adapting already to what's coming to the extent that we should? That's the question I ask myself. I don't think it's only about the lack of awareness. I know, because having been in this space for a very long time, society is better informed than ever before about climate change impact. I seldom nowadays find someone that denies that humans are causing climate change, or that climate change is real and is already impacting on us. It's becoming generally accepted, but why is the world not mitigating? Why is the world not rapidly reducing carbon dioxide emissions? So how do we facilitate something that we call transdisciplinarity and transformative change? So it means, how do scientists start to work far more closely with, say, the city of Johannesburg, or with the Gauteng Premier's office, or with national government, so across levels of government? How do scientists and policymakers start to really walk a path together to build relationships of trust, so that the science can at last become action? That, I think, is a big challenge, and it's also a challenge for academics. And that science of transdisciplinarity is becoming increasingly important. So for us also as a group of academic colleagues, there is much work left to be done to convert, in my case, the field I'm working on, specifically climate science, into action. Over to you, Dr. Naidu. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. What I would like to challenge our colleagues here in the room today is to think about the role that we play in society as knowledge generators, and about challenging our students to be more policy relevant in their approach to science. Yes, everyone wants a PhD. Yes, everyone wants a master's. Yes, everyone wants a degree. Yes, everyone wants NSFAS. But the bottom line is that we have to see ourselves as the knowledge generators of society. And if we are using taxpayers' money to generate that knowledge, at least the knowledge should be to the benefit of society. I published my first paper in 2007. I think beyond the reviewers and my supervisor and myself, I don't think anyone has ever read the paper. And in fact, I don't think anyone will ever read the paper, because it was perhaps the greatest waste of time and money in my entire career. I believe that no knowledge generated is a waste of time, because people learn from generating that knowledge. But I actually feel bad about that paper. I actually think that if I thought a little bit more, if my supervisor had pushed me a little bit more to make the paper more relevant to society's needs, I think it could have been a greater benefit to society. So I would challenge the supervisors in the room here today to please encourage your students to think about the relevance of the science that they are doing in their PhDs and in their masters. And I would challenge us as supervisors to perhaps think a little bit less about the bean counting that can very quickly become a reality in one's life when one is at a university, and just try to contribute more towards policy relevant science. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Naidu and Prof. Francois. Please, before I release you, there is one more question just came in now. I have to take, can we please take that one? It reads as follows. Dr. Bonghan, I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrong. In Africa, especially Cameroon, the food, spices, and medicinal plants has contributed a lot to the prevention and control of COVID. But instead, the campaign is on vaccine. Why are we not talking about the natural products when the climate change and human activities limiting the availability? I'm not sure who of you will start to respond to that, but I think, yes, I'll just leave it Perhaps Professor Francois, you may start.
So I don't think there is clear peer-reviewed evidence available that anything else than the vaccines can really curb the growth, I mean, the continued transmission of COVID-19, except, of course, these very clear-cut non-pharmaceutical control measures such as social distancing, wearing masks, and so forth. So I'm not an expert in immunology or virology, so there I'm listening to what the mainstream science and the peer-reviewed science is saying. And the mainstream advice from the peer-reviewed evidence right now is that the number one tool we have to combat the pandemic is vaccines. And until the vaccines have been distributed much more widely across the developing world, we will continue to need social distancing, wearing masks, and so forth. And those are really the tools we have right now to combat the pandemic. Nothing else has made it into the peer review literature, and therefore I do not accept claims that anything else is helping us at this point in time.
Thank you, Prof.
So I think the answer to that is my answer is very much in line with what Prof has just mentioned. If we are going to be responsible as scientists to those in the room today and those that will see this recording, we have to understand that the approach towards any pandemic or disaster that threatens human life should be approached using the most efficient and evidence-based solution. And at present, the shortest straight line distance between the problem and the solution is a vaccine, and the solution with the greatest evidence is a vaccine. So we cannot discount the value of other approaches, but in a period of disaster, there are two approaches that should be prioritized, one of efficiency and one of evidence. And the vaccine meets both those requirements.
Thank you so very much once again. That was indeed a thought-provoking, inspiring, informative session that we had today for the webinar, and I would like to thank all the presenters. If we were in one room, I was gonna say, let's give, a round of applause, but you can do the visual, applause. We do have, that as well. We can give that to our presenter. Thank you so very much. But at the core of everything that we've talked about today, it's more about making science to be practical, aligning to the SDGs, but also the paradigm shift that is necessary, as well as looking at the individual and the collective effort while looking at the policies, tying that up. It's more about coming up with the solutions to our societal challenges that are practical, not only sitting in our, labs. We need to be scientists that are active citizens. Thank you so very much once more. At this point, I think I'll be handing over to Dr. Mari, but before that, I can see that Emilia, you were asking for the details of the presenters. I think the organizing committee will take care of that. Thank you so very much to everyone, the participants, the attendees, the delegates. It has been a very engaging session. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Mari.
Thank you so much, Dr. Josama. Maybe I would start by appreciating you for such a passionate facilitation that you did today. We really enjoyed the journey together and we were on time. I like to thank you for the energy and all the leading you took today. Much appreciation to all our presenters for the insightful presentations that we received today, as well as thought-provoking. Really, it was time worth investing in today. I would like to say there was a lot of education taking place, a lot of learning, a lot of reinventing our things and rethinking on how we should approach this whole issue together. I would like to appreciate mostly to say that some of the issues being reiterated or being emphasized here, especially to students, is to say, normally we think that we are not into the policy influencing belt, or we can't do that, or we will do that later. But today we have learned that we can start now. We can start now to join everybody in trying to bring solutions to what we are facing currently. With the presentations, they were all intertwining together. We started with Dr. Marx, where he was bringing in the issue of energy and science to generate knowledge, and also the issue of change in behavior and mindset, because it all starts with us. And it linked with Dr. Naidu with this presentation on us not thinking that climate change is due to natural effects, but also the human effects, and what are we doing with regards to reducing that and reducing its impact to the environment. And we also heard from Dr. Bieni about how this had an impact to the economy, and the most affected sector being agriculture, and the most influence being the epidemics, and so on and so forth. So it was really connecting from one presenter to the other. And lastly, with Prof. Engelbrecht, we had to understand and have a deep thought on really seeing the reality of climate change. And if we are not taking action in 10 to 20 years to come, then it will be really a real disaster. So what will become of us? So time is now for all of us to join hands together in trying to bring in the issues of adaptation and mitigation. Despite the pandemic that we are facing, what should we do? How proactive should we? And it's time for action. It's time to really act, all of us. So we really appreciate presenters for all this, and this was really insightful, and we are looking forward to more presentations tomorrow and to keep on learning. Somebody said that we consider ourselves relevant to any engagement, so that we keep adding to what we have already. So let's continue to have that mentality and continue to shape the solution together in trying to mitigate the impacts and effects of climate change in Africa and beyond. So with this, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, and thank you so much for everyone for coming, and also for the questions that were raised. They added on to more knowledge and more engagement, which we much need for this particular dialogue. So we appreciate you for that. Much appreciation to the organizers and all the stakeholders that are behind this dialogue. So for this today, we are ending here, but we are saying we are continuing tomorrow. So may we please all come again tomorrow and continue with this debate, so that at the end of the day, we see where should we go forward with this particular issue of really seeing the reality of climate change and trying to really adapt and mitigate and being resilient. Like what has been said, that the resilient is not only about the climate change, but also about the pandemic. So may we please come again tomorrow and continue with this important dialogue. With this, I would like to thank everyone, and may you have a lovely evening. Thank you so much, everyone, and Dr. Tozama for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. And bye, everyone.
Thanks, Kolani. Bye.
Goodbye, colleagues. Thank you.